Hi, howdy, and hello, everybody. Let's get into Unit 3 of this long drawn out unit of APUSH Unit 7. We've covered World War One, the Great Depression, the New Deal, and now we move into World War Two. So, the first thing that I'd like to cover is America right after World War One. Rather than addressing things on a national scale, let's discuss things on a global scale. The first thing I want to bring to your attention is the Good Neighbor policy, which was it was enacted kind of through the Dawes Plan. But what is the Good Neighbor policy? The Good Neighbor policy is kind of retracting our actions that we would do under dollar diplomacy. Diplomacy, if I may remind you, is when we're making investments into these lesser developed countries. And due to the Great Depression being like on the horizon for us, and we also have our own massive spendings inside of America. Remember, consumer culture, margin spending, etc., etc. Refer to the part 2 video. We decide to pull back from an economic side of forming relationships and just generally just politically forming good relationships and being a quote unquote good neighbor. This is most seen with our aid to Latin Americans in that Latin American region. The Dawes Plan also kind of moves forward with this good neighbor policy by helping out Germany. I know I just said that we kind of are retracting away from that idea of dollar diplomacy, but the Dawes Plan, what it suggested is that we give money to Germany so that we're on their good side. And it's also kind of rooted into what I was discussing last video, where we give money to Germany, Germany gives money to Britain and France, Britain and France gives money to us. So it is economically benefiting us, but it's also putting us on good terms with Germany because remember, Woodrow Wilson, the president at this time, was worried that the harsh punishments on Germany would result in Germany rising up again and wanting to fight all the other world nations that kind of like beat it while it was down in World War One. So Britain, France, and by association America. And so the Dawes Plan was kind of just efforts to leave America on good terms with Germany. The next thing I want to discuss is a return to an isolationist policy. After World War One, we kind of stopped imperializing different areas and we kind of retracted back into our shell so that we can avoid major wars like World War One. And this was enforced through the self-imposed neutrality acts, which spanned from 1935 to 1937. But the main idea here is that we are trying to stick to our foreign policy. We're trying to stay consistent in isolationism and neutrality, but we're going to see that doesn't really stick. Now let's move on to the European side and kind of this build up toward World War II, where here we have Benito Mussolini, who was the leader for Italy during this time period. Mussolini rises to power, and what he does is that he begins the rise of fascism in Italy. And fascism can kind of be fascism is kind of just aggressive nationalism, and this is also in part like the same with Nazism, the political ideology behind the Nazi Party, which was um under the rule of Hitler. But that's for a couple slides now. But just know that Mussolini was rising to power here. He had support. He was very adored by the public in a way, which meant that there wasn't much internal conflict during World War II and with um during the conflict itself, and politically a lot of people were in support of fascism. And this, remember, nationalism here is the important thing, well, pride in your nation. So again, like, generally things were good for Mussolini during his rise. um I bring back this image from, I believe, the Unit 1 video because again, this is just reiterating Wilson's fears that with the harsh punishments put onto Germany through the Treaty of Versailles, a, an evil would once again rise out of Germany after a while. And his worries were like they were well placed because out of the punishments from the Treaty of Versailles comes the fall of the Weimar Republic and comes the rise of Hitler. So yeah, Weimar Republic, it's starting to fail the German citizens, which leads to Hitler kind of staging his own takeover of the government. And through his continuous efforts of a takeover, he gets imprisoned. And while he's in prison, he writes the infamous Mein Kampf, which is in part the basis for the Nazi Party, alongside ideas of fascism and an even more aggressive nationalism. All of these contribute to the establishment of the Nazi Party and the Nazist ideology, which, as many know, was very anti Semitic, and through that ideology, the Holocaust was pushed forward, and the Holocaust will once again come up. But it's important to establish that these anti-Semitic views were cemented here, with Hitler taking over Germany's government and Nazism becoming the primary political ideology for Germany. And this is shown greatest on display in the event known as Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, where Hitler's party is literally launching a large riots against the Jewish people of Germany. Very anti-Semitic wave, obviously, very violent, and it just goes to show the extent to which Hitler's ideology and how far he's willing to enforce this ideology to kind of further his own goals and beliefs. But yes, main thing here: Hitler's in power, Mussolini's in power, and eventually they do team up because again, their ideologies are very similar, and they kind of have the same goals of wanting to recover and become powerful again on a global scale after they've been beaten down due to World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. And excuse me, but Germany begins to rearm itself under Hitler's rule because again they strive for power. They're trying to again rise on a global scale. And remember how the Treaty of Versailles kind of banned that? Well, this again roots back to what I was discussing previously about the League of Nations not having the power to kind of put down and stop Germany from rearming itself. It's just excessive finger wagging because the League of Nations and every other nation is like dirt poor. Because remember, during this time period, there was a global Great Depression, and a lot of countries and a lot of the national superpowers present on the League of Nations, like Britain and France, they were dirt poor and they still had to pay back America in war debts. And generally, the League of Nations just wasn't in a very strong place. Put it as having all bark, no bite. And that's what it was. It was all bark, no bite. And eventually, Hitler and his party, his militant Nazi party, get out of hand and they start taking over different territories. I believe they took a they took over a part of Rome at one point, but that was before the Munich conference, where Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, he meets with Hitler to discuss ending the takeover of these territories because again Germany is like very obviously growing in power under an evil, just flat out evil um leader, and Britain expresses like the disdain that not only like Britain itself, but the whole League of Nations has towards Hitler's actions. And so, since they can't really convince Hitler to stop just through words, they follow this policy of appeasement. I should have written this in actually, but they they just keep giving Hitler and his party these pieces of land. Like this cartoon puts it best, they give him these milk bottles, and these symbolize like territory, and it keeps him satisfied for a while where he won't continue expanding, but eventually you're gonna run out of milk, or it's just gonna be too taxing, and then it all culminates in one big event where the baby here cries. In this case, Hitler he just decides to make his own move, which he does when invading Poland, and he's given a piece of Poland because policy of appeasement, giving some territory, not a lot, where it's too like detrimental. But he does give up. Chamberlain does give up a piece of Poland, but ultimately Hitler invades all of Poland and tries to take over the whole territory. And this is where they come into conflict with France, and Germany just completely overpowers France and takes it over because of their military strategy, excuse me, of blitzkrieg, where it's just focused on an all-out assault, a very extraneous assault, and that just overwhelms the French forces, and France is officially under Germany's rule. And by this point in time, it's pretty much solidified that Germany and Italy are working together as allies in this conflict between the League of Nations, well, most of the League of Nations and Germany and Italy. But if you know World War II, you know there's one big nation left out from the conflicts on the side of Germany and Italy, and that's Japan. And just to get into Japan and their cause for joining World War II, um, Japan wants natural resources because they are a newly industrial nation around the time of, I believe, the 1800s. And they want their industrial resources. They can grow as a nation. They can become powerful, just like how Britain, France, and America and all these other nations are as powerful. Like, I didn't mention it in the any of the videos because it didn't necessarily tailor to APUSH, but in World, you learn about the Meiji Restoration and how Commodore Matthew Perry went to Japan and he came with his warships and he basically forced them to begin industrializing. And in a way, Japan wanted to be like Matthew Perry. They wanted to have the big guns, and so they tried to find more resources so that they can further their industrialization and become a real force to be reckoned with. That leads into the Second Sino-Japanese War, where Japan has a conflict and sort of a takeover of a fraction of China, and inevitably Japan just does take over a fraction of China, if not all of China, or at least a majority of it. And that is just a snowball effect from there, where Japan then continues its imperial ventures, again, like I just said with China, but also with some Pacific islands. And it all culminates, at least at a climax, with Pearl Harbor in 1941, December 7th, a date to live in infamy. Japan has its takeover of Pearl Harbor, remember, an American owned territory which we got through imperialism. And we have our conflict there, and that is officially what launches the US into the conflict. That's what, again, like entices us to join World War II. But remember, we're still trying to stick with our isolationist policy, and a major part of that is because we fear that democracy will be lost. I got this cartoon from a book you should be getting from Mr. Oda's APUSH class if you're taking APUSH. It should be all the way in the back. But this document I like because it brings up a very valid fear that many Americans had, that they want to stick to isolationism because they feared that democracy would be lost if we lost this war. And we are one of the last strongholds of democracy. France is gone, Britain is weak, and all the other nations stand no chance against Germany. We are the only nation that can really hold ourselves down and protect ourselves. And in the mad Europe that's going on, we need to decide if we're going to defend ourselves or help democracy around the world. And if you know America and their political ventures with imperialism, a strong motivator for that was protecting democracy, and that applies here too. We decide to join World War II to protect democracy. So America enters World War II, but they have to fight two different fronts. The European front is the primary one, where our goals are to reclaim France and defeat the Nazi Party and defeat Hitler. And on the Pacific front, we aim to defeat Japan because they are currently having their dominion in the Pacific Islands, and we're kind of close to that. So we're gonna have our own fight there. Now we move on to the core of World War II, where we have four different topics to cover: the home front, so just mobilization, politics during this time period, technology, technological advancements, and the conflict itself, I'll say for last, because there is a bombshell, no pun intended, in the conflict that I want to end off with. Home front. So, very similar to World War One, we have the return of war bonds and war industry boards, where we still just have a greater focus on war production and producing resources and allocating them. Unions agreed to no strikes because, similar to with the New Deal, unions, this is like a time where we're very economically vulnerable because this is just coming out of the New Deal, which, although was efficiently helping the economy, it didn't revive us. It was the mass production that was demanded of this war that revived the economy. And so unions still agreed to having no strikes because there is a greater, like, there is a massive threat that requires like continuous production that can't be impeded upon. And like I just said like three times, like this revives the economy. This is what brings America back to stability in a way. And we also, again, just have our advertisement and propaganda toward having war bonds so that we can support the soldiers on both fronts. Oh, Rosie the Riveter. So I'm pretty sure you've heard a lot about Rosie the Riveter in your time learning history. So Rosie the Riveter, wow, very much an icon for uh, female empowerment, and she becomes very popular during this time period because while the men are at war, it's the women who have to step up and take over the factory jobs. So massive, massive step for female empowerment going forward and toward just again progression a progression for females in society, and again just continuity here with the Lowell Mill girls. We have Lowell Mill girls, excuse me, showing that they can efficiently like hold up and produce for a factory, and that again is just shown here with Rosie the Riveter propaganda and how females are really holding it down on the home front in terms of production with resources and stuff for the war. Moving forward, FDR in politics, he establishes the Lend-Lease Act, which officially kind of ends the policy of isolationism and ends our neutrality. We officially lend arms to Britain in order to aid them. And we have the Atlantic Charter, which officially establishes that relationship with Britain that we have that will make us official allies with them in the war. Also, politics wise, we have African American soldiers who joined the war effort, and we have 1 million soldiers joining the war effort. This was done in hopes that by succeeding in the war and by making a real impact, African Americans and their value in society would be further recognized. Because remember, this is still a very kind of hostile climate toward African American citizens in America, not only in the South, but also a bit in the North, because we have the KKK and we have segregation still. And so, in hopes of having an impact in the war, they hope that their like position in society would like uh develop and further, and that the hostility towards them would diminish at least in the slightest. But it really didn't. They came home, no confetti, no cheering. They just came home and continued with their lives. So, in my opinion, this is probably the first step toward a civil rights. This is the first step of the civil rights movement, where after witnessing and experiencing all these tribulations, there is no real progress made, and so this is kind of just the spark that sets off the fire for the civil rights movement, which we'll see in the next video in the 1950s and 1960s. Japanese Americans during this time period also experience some heat because they're seen as a threat to the US, where a lot of them were accused of being spies or accused of espionage, and a lot of them are rounded up in these internment camps where they were displaced from their homes and forced to live in these camps for the duration of the war. And again, this just continues that continuity of America overextending its power during times of war, because this is very possessive, and just it's very apparent that this isn't appropriate behavior just to treat citizens and treat people. That's the simplest way I can put it. And this oh, never mind. Let's just continue with the continuity. Just to reiterate, Alien and Sedition Acts, Habeas Corpus with Civil War, Espionage and Sedition Acts, FDR's Court Packing, New Edition, and our latest edition, Japanese internment camps during World War II. I I keep reiterating this because continuity is very important to this curriculum. Being able to recognize trends will get you that complexity point on your DBQ or LEQ. And these internment camps are fought by Japanese American citizen Korematsu, where he does argue that these internment camps are unjust, but in the end, the US did win the case, and that's because of the nativist sentiment that has been building throughout history ever since immigration really came in waves, ever since the market revolution in the 1800s. Nativism has been present. Again, continuity, very important to understand here. It's not like this is some like new um this new concept, this new like discrimination towards immigrants, towards like people of a foreign origin. Like it began with the Irish and discrimination towards them, with the Know Nothing Party, a political party that was kind of just anti-immigrant as a whole, and it again continued with Chinese immigrants during the Industrial Revolution, kind of clustered up in Chinatowns in California and living in uh, ghettos and cultural enclaves. And it continues here with Japanese Americans who were seen as a threat to America for no particular reason, like despite just there being like fear and war. And this decision was ultimately just showcasing the nativist sentiment that America had and how fear and nativism like controlled them during this time. Technology wise, very bare bones and simple slide, honestly, because what else can you really say? Radar and sonar technology is developed to counter um, German submarines. There was a conflict, a very minor conflict, where it was the British Navy versus German Navy and German planes, and radar and sonar technology was very substantial in that battle and generally throughout the war effort. The Colossus 2 is developed, one of the first supercomputers ever utilized and made, very impactful for the war effort. And the biggest technological advancement, the Manhattan Project, where if if you watched Oppenheimer, you would know that the Manhattan Project, um, it was helping, excuse me, it was aiding in the creation of the atomic bomb for World War II. It was sort of like, I think of it as a big red button, where they're developing this war-ending device where once that big red button is pressed, the war is done. And this is just highlighting the destructive capabilities and advancements in war that are occurring. Moving on to the conflict on, let's start with the European front. We have 1943, the Battle of Sicily. This was the attack on Italy in order to kind of give Mussolini the boot. And this attack was very successful, except Hitler kind of had to bail out Mussolini and his forces because Mussolini was just losing the battle, like severely. And in the end, Mussolini gets bailed out, and America and Britain take over a large portion of Italy. And on to the more important battle, the most important battle of the European front is in 1944 with D-Day. D-Day is the takeover on a Germany-ruled France where uh, America and Britain are collaborating toward taking over France to kind of restore France's power in their country. So yeah, we enter. It's a very long, very hard battle. Battle of the Bulge was the turning point in D-Day, and like inevitably Germany gets the boot. Hitler commits suicide. The German forces surrender, and we kind of win on the European front from here. France is reestablished as their own nation with no ruler besides themselves. So yeah, that kind of ends things for the European front as Mussolini then shortly after surrenders. Now onto the Pacific front. It's a much more drawn out battle with no support from Britain on this side of the war. Just America and Japan butting heads, contending with each other a lot, where a lot of battles often resulted in either a loss or like a stalemate. It was only until the Battle of Midway in 1942 that we saw a massive turning point, a massive turnaround for the American forces, where after this point, for the for the next 2-ish years, we see our forces completely pounding on Japan to the point where they come to a point of desperation where they begin using kamikaze pilots in hopes of even just doing some damage to American forces. So we're kind of forcing Japan to give everything they have during this time period, and that culminates in 1945 with the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Japan, backed into a corner, says, "We will not surrender. We will continue fighting until we win or we die." And um, America is and the American government is faced with a very hard choice, where do they do they continue the war effort with just soldiers fighting Japanese soldiers and a lot more blood is spilled, but they don't have to drop the atom bomb, or do they press the big red button and end the war right here and now and no more American blood is spilled? And it was a very tough decision. Imagine having to make that move where you're killing thousands, hundreds of thousands of innocents to end a war to save American blood, or you continue the war and spare the innocents in exchange for people putting themselves in the line of duty. Very tough call, but inevitably, as we know, two bombs are dropped, one on Hiroshima, one on Nagasaki. That forces Japan to surrender because it's just too much. And this decision obviously was very heated because innocents died. Like people who had no issue with the war, and people, maybe even people who were against the war, had to suffer because of this very hard decision. And that ended World War II completely. This is the end of World War II. And let's move on to post war conferences. First, we have the Yalta Conference, which divided Germany into four areas after the reestablishment of France and Hitler's suicide and the defeat of the Nazi forces. So, Germany is divided between America, Britain, France, and Russia. And what happens is that, yeah, pretty much just that. They all focus on rebuilding Germany into a democratic nation, except, as you may know, Russia didn't necessarily have that political ideology in mind with their sector of Germany, a conflict that we'll go into in the next video. But moving on with the Yalta Conference, all the Eastern European countries were liberated and they decided their political ideology just based off sort of this free sovereignty esque idea, despite being around a communist Russia. And the Potsdam Conference, which came at the absolute end of World War II, it was discussion about Japan's surrender, pretty much, and just allocating more resources toward Germany. But the more important thing to come out of here is issues between the new president, Harry Truman, and Joseph Stalin, where Truman kind of adopts this get tough persona with America, where he has to act like a tough guy to really just like stand his ground and prove that he's like not like America is like the big guy now, because I think this kind of just solidifies America as the paramount world power in contention with Russia, which again we'll see in the next video. But ultimately, everything ends with the formation of the United Nations, and the UN doesn't really need much explanation. Coalition of many, 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 many countries, democratic countries around the world, except for Russia, which we'll get into again in the next video. But yeah, UN is formed, and that's the end. So yeah, that wraps up Unit 7 of APUSH. This was World War II. Next video, we will be getting into the very lengthy, very intricate Cold War spanning 40 years of American history. The US versus the Communist Russia, which I know I haven't really been talking about. That's because I've been saving everything for the Unit 8 videos. So I will catch you all then. Bye bye.